this week. I'm Emily Westhofen, the Executive Director of the German American Business Council, also known as GABC. We are a membership organization focused on fostering the exchange between German and American businesses and business people. And if this is your first virtual or even in general event with us here at the GABC, a very warm welcome. If you came to us through announcements on social media and you're not yet on our mailing list or a member, we encourage you to sign up or become a member. A very, very warm welcome to all our attendees today, joining from the greater Boston area, but also from overseas in Germany. I think we have a couple of people joining from there. We've had a very high interest in this update today, and we're very happy that we were able to offer this to you at such short notice. Just a quick rundown of what we're offering today and little few housekeeping events. All participants are on mute, and you can choose to be on or off camera. If you're losing connection to this event, please use the same link to rejoin. If you have a question, please submit it via the chat function during the event. We will monitor this and try to address that as many questions as possible. And we're also recording this event, so you know. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Doug Hauer is a member in the Mintz Corporate and Security Practice. Corporate and Security Practice and Immigration Practice. In the immigration law space, Doug represents corporate, institutional, and individual clients in routine and complex immigration matters. He has an in-depth experience advising companies on the immigration consequences of corporate restructuring, as well as representing clients in immigration-related investigations involving the US DOL, the USCIS, and the FBI. Liz Goss of Goss Associates specializes in the representation of physicians, researchers, trainees, and students in the higher education and healthcare fields, securing their temporary and permanent visas. She's nationally recognized for expertise in representing professors, scientists, and artists under the Extraordinary Ability, Outstanding Researcher, and National Interest Waiver immigrant visa categories. I would like to also preface this event today that both Liz and Doug are not providing legal advice, but general information only. Both of our speakers want to be sure that everyone understands that the general information in this session is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to review your individual facts and circumstances and to secure legal advice that takes into account your specific and personal facts. So I would like to thank both again for making themselves available exactly actually to the date. April 25th, we had our first immigration event and update, which was following the executive order in April. And now we have a new issued executive order. So thank you very much for making yourselves available to talk about what happened this past Monday. If I can review what is in place right now, we have a travel ban that's in place that was issued, earlier in March and subsequently also in the following weeks, and that still impacts obviously European countries as well as Brazil, China, etc. That unless you are an American citizen or permanent resident, you cannot travel to the United States. And that, as far as we know, doesn't have an expiration date and it could be lifted maybe any day or not, but currently they remain in place. And then in April, President Trump issued an executive order limiting, in particular issuing some of the green cards, and that's when we spoke last. So now we're fast forwarding to June 22nd and what was happening this week. So Doug, I'd like to start with you. Can you provide us some context around the issuing of the latest executive order that was signed late Monday afternoon? I hope you're unmuted.
Yes, of course. Thanks,
welcome,
Emily, for having us here today. I want to avoid being too political because I don't think that that contributes to anything. I think we have an administration that has now a pattern of issuing proclamations or executive orders on immigration that restrict rights, that restrict travel, This is very different from the previous administration, which used the executive order to expand rights, like under DACA. Um, I think the context here is complicated. The executive orders are clearly positioned in a way to achieve some impact in the United States. Those of us who are somewhat cynical of the administration's motives think that this is sort of the political equivalent to blowing a dog whistle to gather your supporters around you. You issue an immigration order restricting L and H visa holders from entering the United States. What you essentially do is you appeal to the segments in American life who have an anti-immigrant stance. But, you know, Emily, in terms of the political context, we can't forget that the United States has just been through several weeks of civil chaos. And the Floyd incident has raised awareness of more than ever before of issues of race in the United States. So the timing too of this executive order is interesting because it follows two Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court expanded protections for gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender people in the workplace, and where, frankly, the Trump administration lost in trying to really take away DACA rights for people who are here unlawfully. So there's a greater political context here, but I want to mention one more thing before I turn this over to Liz to talk about sort of the actual order and its substance. You know, what's good news for everybody on this webinar. What's really good news is that Trump, at the end of the day, operates in an ecosystem where Republican leadership in the Senate and the House, they do, I think, try to control him to some degree on immigration issues. Because I think on both sides of the political aisle, there's a recognition that you can't stop large companies from doing business in the United States. If you do that in an election year, you're gonna have trouble. So when, you know, Liz will talk about the order, many of us were much more frightened of it when we heard about it on Friday, when we heard it was coming down. At the end of the day, its impact is there. I don't want to minimize that, but it isn't quite what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah, and so thank you, Doug, for giving us a little bit of context, you know, what is happening in the bigger Washington realm. And so Liz, yeah, as Doug said, if you could give us some meat, you know, and explain what exactly the executive order included, especially, you know, what categories, but then also, you know, the exemptions, because I think that's usually really where the interesting part is, who is excluded.
Yeah, so, you know, following up on what Doug said, that the order was issued, but it was issued with a whole lot of caveats. And I think the first thing for non-legal folks to understand is the power, the actual power that the president has in issuing these executive orders. So, you know, under this executive order, the president certainly has a power under a national interest to keep people out of the United States. But usually we think of a national interest in terms of a security interest. Or, you know, under COVID, it's public health. And the most recent one, I think they would position that under economic recovery. So, you know, the general theme of an executive order and the power is in the power of the president to regulate who comes in and out of the borders of the United States. So that is a single power that the president has under national interest circumstances. But once somebody's in the United States, the president does not have a power to shut down wholesale, you know, any kind of immigration processing. We have a process in our country whereby the regulations and the laws that we have to pass through Congress. So you either need an act of Congress to, you know, to have some new immigration regulations or, you know, amendments to our current ones, or there's something called a rulemaking process. So once a law is passed, they go into the different bureaucratic entities that are responsible for example, for giving benefits in our immigration system. You file for any benefit with the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Service, USCIS, when you're inside the United States. So those the laws would be under those different entities, and they issue rules that tell us what the specifics are for that process. And in order to change the rules, the president can't also change the rules by executive authority. We have a rulemaking process in the United States, which is cumbersome, and it takes some time. So it's not something that can be done overnight. We do have a short-term rulemaking process, but even in the shortest term rulemaking process, you're talking about at least several months. It has to go to the Office of Budget and Management, where they do some assessments as to the impacts on the taxpayer and the general public and different kinds of things. There has to be a public notice and comment period. The short form of that is a 30-day notice and comment period, but most of the time it's 60 to 90 days. And then it goes back to OMB for them to review, and then maybe at some point we'll get a rule issued. So, I just want to assure people that for those of you who are in the United States and who are on these visa categories or looking to change to these visa categories, an executive order cannot take those benefits away from you. So it's a very specific process that would have to be undertaken here in the United States for impact while you're inside the U.S. So now we take a look specifically at the executive order that was recently issued. And of course, we all know that the executive order explicitly barred processing or suspension of new visa stamps for the following categories: H-1B, H-4, H-2B, J-1 certain categories. So J-1 only certain categories, L-1s and L-2s. So what does that mean? For those of you outside the United States or thinking to go abroad, if you currently have anybody but the Canadians can come into, when they come into the United States, before you come in, you have to go to a U.S. consulate or embassy. So that's the State Department. And you have to get something called a visa folio, that visa sticker that's in your passport with your photo on it. So that visa stamp or that visa sticker is mailing an entry ticket. So you need that in order to enter the United States. So if you already have that entry ticket for any one of the categories I just listed, you would be exempt from this executive order. So the executive order only bans requests for new stamps or visa folios. So that's the first thing. So if you already have this, you're not impacted by this executive order. Applicants in other visa categories. So any of the non-immigrant visa options not listed in the ban specifically. O1As for people of extraordinary ability, O1Bs for artists of distinctions, E3, TN, H1B1s, the trade visas for Singapore and Chile, E2s, E3s. F1 students in any, F1 students attending school, OPT or STEM OPT, J1 students, scholars, short-term scholars, specialists, trainees, and researchers. So those are the academic J1 visas. Those are excluded from this executive order as well. So if you're looking to come in on any of those kinds of visa categories, you're also excluded under you're also not included in the executive order. In addition, as I said before, anybody who has a Canadian passport is visa folio. They don't have to get that visa folio or visa stamp from a U.S. embassy or consulate overseas. So they are also exempt from this executive order.
Doug, do you want to jump in there? If not, to just expand. Yeah. If not, I can certainly go down a list of further questions.
Sure. So I saw a little ping in the chat. What about renewals? So the order is very clear. If you're physically present in the United States the day that order was issued, you're exempt. And you're exempt from the ban. So if you're here, you were here this week and you have an L1 visa that's expiring Thursday, and you go to renew, then I think we probably need to be very careful. We need to watch closely how the State Department is going to interpret this new proclamation. But the plain language of the proclamation suggests that being physically in the United States makes you exempt from the order. Now, if you are with a valid visa now and you need to travel in, say, 3 months to get a new visa once consulates reopen, right? Or some consulates are already operating and issuing visas, and some aren't, and some have very limited capacity. But let's say you're German and your visa stamp expires this summer and the travel ban is lifted. I'm not going to say carte blanche, don't presume that you have anything ever to worry about. I think even though we believe that physical presence in the United States creates an exemption or takes you out of the class of people who are impacted, we don't know yet. It's too early to know exactly how consulates are going to read the rules. One of the reasons, by the way, that these two visas in particular were selected out, it was not, well, not just two. It was HSLs, H2Bs, certain Js. These visas were selected out by the administration as a statement. And the unemployment rate in the United States in the last 3 months has been that of, at different times, exceeded that of what we had in unemployment under the Great Depression before all of us were born. That's important because these visas that we're talking about, where the Trump administration has created this policy, are all visas where people would come and work in the United States. And there have been, when you talk about the J visa for trainees and for interns and the H and the L categories, there have been abuses. This is an issue. So the administration selected these visas out very specifically. But if you have a visa stamp now and you're abroad, if you have a valid L1 or L2 or H1 or H4 visa, and you're abroad, but you have that visa in your passport, that visa is still valid. The proclamation does not invalidate the visa. If you need to extend a visa once the travel ban is lifted and consulates are operational, and I think we should talk more about that today. I don't think that's around the corner. I think we're some ways off. I think you absolutely must consult with a lawyer who knows all your facts and who can look at how the proclamation is being interpreted at that time. And I would even say, out of an abundance of caution, I would advise anyone who's traveling to actually email the consular post and make sure that they agree. At their post specifically in Frankfurt or in Vienna, are they adopting the policy that they can renew the visa and reissue? We might see sort of incongruous or ununiform rollout here. We might see some confusion. The order wasn't drafted very well. So there is some room for interpretation. And I think you want to be very careful not to assume. I think before you leave the United States to go apply for a visa, you should be talking to a lawyer, get the advice, make sure that you're good. Everything's buttoned up because we are in an unusual situation. Also, I've heard anecdotally that of some denials already under the ban. So there are some posts that are issuing visas right now. And I've heard anecdotal denials that L1 and H1 applicants who've gone in have gotten just a blanket refusal, and they've been told, we can't do anything for you until the proclamation period has expired.
So that's basically what an appointment, but then they were denied while they were at the appointment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because some U.S. consulates are operational and still in the business of looking at routine visas.
Right.
Not in the EU, not in Schengen, not in the UK, not in Brazil. But you have some consular posts that are issuing visas. And anecdotally, I heard just literally 40 minutes before this meeting about a few denials under the proclamation. And the, you know, consular officers said, look, we had our hands tied. Yeah, our hands are bound.
All right. So let's look at a couple more of the questions. There's one from Ursula regarding actually green card and whether you think that could be taken away, or when you leave the US, will you be able to come back to the US? Under the green card, a permanent resident status, that is not affected, right? Not from the travel ban or from the nudity executive order, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And anybody who's a green card holder is not affected. They're explicitly excluded. And then anybody who has something called advanced parole. So if somebody's in the middle of a green card application, you get a travel permit that allows you to come in and out of the United States without having to get that visa folio that I was talking about earlier. Those folks are also excluded from the travel ban.
All right. So I think, I know, Doug, you partly addressed this. There's a question regarding if you need to renew a visa and you need to go to a US embassy to travel and then to return into the US, whether you would be affected by the travel ban or not. So that is where you said, you know, you really need to look into the personal circumstances and see if you have everything ready to actually do that. Let's say you have an appointment.
Yeah, well, first, if you got an appointment anywhere in the EU, unless
you have to leave the US, yes, to go there.
Yeah, let's say you're in the US and you said you were able to schedule an appointment for July 13th in Paris. I can pretty much promise you that appointment's going to be canceled. So I know from one consular official with whom I spoke on Monday, they are canceling out all the appointments now that were in June, and they're not going to be doing anything in July. I think you've got to be very careful about departing the United States, because once you leave, getting back in can be tricky. Now, one question that I noticed, Emily, that in the same vein popped up in the chat was, let's say I think you're a German and you don't have an H or an L visa, or maybe you do, and you want to go to a country where a U.S. consular or where a U.S. consular post is operating to get a visa issued. Are you banned because you're German? Like, does being German ban you? And that's not the case. What we've got is a very peculiar, from the previous order, a very peculiar provision that says if you have been in the Schengen territory or a few other countries in the 14 days preceding entering the U.S., you're not allowed in. So that's given rise to the speculation, oh, should I just go try to quarantine in a third country? Well, I don't know. I think before making any kind of elaborate plan like that, you want to be careful, because you could very well end up stuck if that country ends up having a COVID issue, and it may not be so helpful. So I think it's really important to, and I can't say this enough, before you take action, like leave the United States, take stock with a lawyer on your whole case, get a good read on it, make sure before you might get a visa appointment confirmation for a post that says July 19th or whatever. Well, you need to actually email that post and be in touch with them, or your lawyer needs to find out what's the landscape for rescheduling. I think we're going to see more information from the government. Like last night, we found out that all Canadians are exempt from the ban, from this last order. I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to learn more, and the State Department is probably going to put out some guidance. The State Department, through the embassies, has been pretty good about keeping the public informed. On the website of the various consular posts, you can get a lot of good information. But I would not take action, or I would be very cautious if I were here on a visa, and I were, say, German, even though you're not subject to the recent order, because you've got the L visa or the H visa. If you travel to Schengen, suddenly you have this 14-day window issue.
I don't know what exact, oh, sorry, Liz.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in on a few things. I think somebody, you know, as Doug mentioned, and some embassies are working. So in my experience, the embassies that are working are really focused in on essential workers and exceptions for national interest, which, you know, there are exceptions for people who might be working in some national interest, but that hasn't been fully defined. But we've been able to get people through, for example, who are primary care physicians or working on research directly related to COVID. So I think that's the other wrinkle. You might hear that something is operational, but it might be the specific circumstances for that person who is in that third country trying to get that stamp. And, you know, and then for people who are kind of stuck overseas, a few things that we've been looking at, and I'm sure Doug and his team as well, you know, for example, we have some people who have F1 optional practical training, got stuck out, you know, would have preferred to have, you know, received a CAP H-1B, would have preferred to have gotten their visa stamp from the embassy to come back in, but they still have time on their OPT. So they're going to come back to the United States in the category that's not banned. And then we're going to change their status once they get back to the H. So that's, you know, people need to remember that as well. If they can
do that. Yeah. But that probably doesn't apply to anybody in Europe, right? Because they cannot really come in at all.
Well, if you can get it, I mean, again, you know, if you can, if you have a valid F1 student visa in your passport, and you don't have a health, so there's the public health issue, you know, as Doug was saying, right, in the Schengen area. So if the public health issue is that you've touched ground in a place that, you know, our government is deemed to have excessive infection. So there's a 14-day quarantine, you know, they're not going to let anybody in for 14 days. So that's, you know, I think that's a public health issue.
Here's a question. I'm not quite sure what it stands for, but maybe you know. What is the experience with AOS applications, and have they seen significant pushback? Would you know what that stands for?
Adjustment of status. Doug, you want me to handle it, or you want to do it? I think Doug's on mute. I'll go ahead and do it. I'll let him do the next one. So adjustment of status is, you know, when people apply for a green card inside the United States. Okay. And as I said before, processing in the United States is still ongoing. It's a little bit slower, but honestly, it hasn't. I think it's slower mostly because of COVID and because of resources being shifted around and people getting used to working at home. And I haven't seen a huge, I haven't seen stalling at a level that I think it's a trend.
Right.
Yeah, I want to add to that. One thing that we've seen that's a little bit of a bright light is that with adjustment of status, we're seeing more interviews waived. So, you know, the opposite is happening because of social distancing. Somebody though, Emily, I just want to, I was looking at the chat and wanted to address something. Somebody had a very good question about, there's this coded language in this last executive order about like changes down the road. Like, what does it mean? What was the thing? So here's what that was. That was like a message to Congress. It was a message to Congress that Congress needs to step up and restrict the H&EL program and make some changes. The administration knows that to make real, like Liz was saying, real substantive changes to these visas, you have to go through this whole burdensome process of notice and notice and comment under the Administrative Procedures Act, which makes agencies publish rules, read all the comments about the rules, and then send the rules through agencies to get feedback. It's really a lot of work. And so, you know, likelihood that DHS is going to prioritize changes to the H&L rules is totally something none of us can say. I mean, it could happen. But I think what Trump is also doing in that order is he's sort of messaging to Lindsey Graham. He's saying, Lindsey, you know, get your act together. Get some changes, get Congress to step in. Because really, if you want to make real substantive change, the only way to do it is with Congress, and good luck. So for immigration to actually see change, to these visas, you're going to have both parties behind it. You're going to have both the House and the Senate behind it. And so in other words, that's a lot, especially in an election year. And now we're almost in August, just so all you know, like in August, everything closes down in DC, nobody does any work. Like none of the people in Congress do any work. So then in September, they're going to be campaigning. So we're not going to see any big changes right away. And if Trump's out of office, it's a non-issue. But, he could get reelected. And everybody in my universe is so convinced Trump's not going to be reelected, and not to be political, but come on.
Right.
You think that?
Right. So I'll jump back to a question that was submitted via email earlier. Do you think, so whether, e-visas that are currently not affected, right, whether you see that would be something that would come up in the future? I know that is looking a little bit into the future and, just by hearsay, but it currently isn't impacted, correct, the E2 visas?
Yeah, E2 visas aren't impacted, and I don't have a concern about that particular type of visa being impacted. I mean, those are people who are coming in to create new companies, and there's always there's always a tie to job creation beyond the individual who's coming in. So I don't, it's just not on the agenda. Really what's in the H-1Bs have long, as Doug mentioned earlier, H-1Bs, Ls have long been in the sights of restrictionists in this country. And there's unfortunately been some bad actors in this space where there have been abuses in those categories. I don't think it warrants a wholesale shutdown, but these are things that are continuously being brought up, and the E is not in that context at all.
Yeah. I'll go back to the chat that says from Jan, is it possible to extend a J1 researcher visa inside the US, or is it compulsory to leave and book an appointment which I think is probably consulate what he means.
So I'll take that one, Doug. So I think, when you extend your J1, you get a new DS 2019 issued from your program sponsor. That can be done inside the United States. So you can't get a new visa stamp until you leave the United States, but you don't need that unless you're traveling. So yes, you can extend your status. And I saw another person ask the same thing about an L1. Their L1 was expiring. And they can also get that extended to inside the United States. So if you're here, any extensions to L1, H1, any of these visa categories can all still be processed here in the United States if you're physically present.
Then there is a question regarding the ESTA and whether they are impacted by the recent proclamation, but also whether you have any insight on the travel ban and whether that would be lifted, and that way, giving some relief. If there's any talk, does Europe, Europe of course bars right now the travel from Americans to Europe. So there's probably a little bit, well, if you don't, we don't. So you think there is some negotiations going on to lift that, sooner or later, or it's good for?
Yeah. So I would say I just want to preface this because I feel like I have to in 2020 in the United States. I actually believe in science, and so I watch and listen carefully to scientists, and it looks like this COVID dilemma is extremely complicated beyond what anybody ever thought. So that's a good indicator right there that we might not see people traveling like they used to for a long time. I think it's very possible that we're going to see travel restrictions in place on some level, maybe not the extreme ban we have now, but on some level through the end of the year. It's hard to know. I don't think that it's really that easy to get a sense of how quickly this could change or how long it could go, because the COVID situation is so in flux. Florida now has more cases than Massachusetts, and that's a recent spike. Israel is going through a second wave of COVID, and right now none of us really are in a position to say, but I would imagine that that ban is probably going to be in place through the summer, and some version of it is going to be in place at the end of the year. And, you know, if you can avoid getting a visa renewed in 2020 or 21, avoid it, because what's going to occur is the radical sort of situation we're in. What's going to occur is that consulates are going to be able to see only a fraction of the people they saw once this is all over. And in the EU, in Germany, you have a lot of people. You know, I recently talked to a Humboldt fellow who can't get a visa. You know, who's supposed to be starting, you know, this fall on a Humboldt fellowship. I've talked to parents of students who got into places like Princeton and Harvard. They can't get in. There's really not a lot of room right now to move. So we're at this is a sort of watershed time. I mean, things are changing. I think if you can avoid going to a consulate, you're better off doing it, because the appointments are going to be scarce because they've got to implement social distancing procedures at consulates once everything's back up and running. So it's going to be very different.
Right. We have a question regarding the O visa, whether that's affected or not, and whether the village's worker category is impacted through the latest executive order.
So neither one of those two categories are affected. And again, I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. I am here on one kind of visa status. I'm here on an F1. I want to apply for a change of status to H1. Is that okay? If you are here in the United States, unless you're on an ESTA visa, any other visa category, you can apply for a change of status. The one issue are F1 student visas, because you have to, the F1 student visa change of status is tricky because of the way the regulations work. You have to have a valid status within 30 days of the approval to F1. So that's a little bit trickier and more complicated, and it might involve a bridge application, but those can be affected inside the United States. But you need to, you need to get individual advice on the different visa types, what your timing is. But for sure, you can change your status and in the United States to any visa category. There is no bar.
That is actually good news, and I think that's really important to clarify for those who are here and change status. I think I saw a question on the H1 lottery, so my guess is that if somebody has won the H1 lottery and is outside of the country, it's going to be hard to get that visa stamp, right? Because of all the issues that we just said, of the consulates being closed or the embassies or the appointments not being honored. Would that be correct? Doug is on.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, if you are subject to the ban, this recent order, you're outside the United States, you don't have a visa yet, and you're waiting for a visa, you're not coming in this calendar year, unless there's litigation that challenges the order, which there may very well be. I mean, this is all in flux. I guess what we should almost have imprinted on our foreheads, this information is only valid, on June 25th, 2020, because things can change. There could be some litigation, and that could maybe create a situation where the government there could be some kind of restraining order. I kind of doubt it, because the drafters of this recent order were actually quite crafty, and they really worded it, I think, so that everything they did is within the authority of the president. I mean, I think that they very consciously stayed away from substantive legal change and kept it based on the economy. The rationale is the economy and jobs. They even quote, like the Trump administration quotes the Obama administration and Obama on how visas steal jobs from Americans. So I think yeah.
I think, since we're very close to our ending time of 1:15. Maybe if one of you would like to just address basically really if we're talking about businesses and the long term impact on hiring skilled workers or having executives come over here and who are currently not in the country, obviously. What is the best strategy for them to basically think about bringing anybody here at this point?
Do you want me to take that, Doug? I mean, I'll talk for a minute and then I'll leave a few minutes for Doug to finish because I think he'll have some thoughts too. But, I work a lot in the space of academia, and if you can see in the order, it's exempting F and Js in academia. And then, we're doing a lot of discussions about maybe who can qualify for an L versus an H for the beginning of the academic calendar year. So, and then, a lot of small businesses that we work with as well. So there's a lot of discussions and hopeful discussions, in my opinion, about what the fall is going to look like. But, so there are workarounds. So potentially if you can get somebody in on another visa category, you could change them to an L. So if they have to come in for a business meeting on a B1, they have that in their passport, they can get in. And that's a big if, because you have to balance that against the reality of what's happening on the ground with regards to the public health crisis we're facing. I mean, if you look at just yesterday, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey now have a mandatory quarantine for anybody coming from a hotspot from somewhere else in the United States. So we're not even talking about quarantines for people coming in from abroad. This is about interstate issues. So I think we are in a big question mark time period because we just don't know how this virus is going to travel over the next few months. And I'll leave it to Doug to wrap up.
Yes. Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, so I think if you're in HR or operations or planning for a business, I think there are three things you've got to be thinking about. Number one, you've got to be rethinking how you use strategically resources. And in the old days of 2019, people would fly over for meetings. Forget it. I think that we're in a period where in the next year, that's just not going to be how we work. And people are going to have to get accustomed to working differently. The second thing is do not become dependent or overly dependent on H&L visas for your workforce. We could see Congress take a pass on rewriting the rules for these categories, but those agencies, USCIS, or Department of Homeland Security, has an ability to hike fees, and we think that's where we're really headed. The fees are going to become radically high. Salary requirements are going to be stratospheric. There are just going to be changes. I think the third thing that I would suggest is that, if you are in a leadership role at a company and you have employees, try to keep them calm. I mean, there's so much noise about these issues, and I spent probably 100 hours since Friday on the phone. And my message is like the same. It's, your people are not impacted, or if they are, it's very minimal. And you know what? People can't travel anyways. And this really is not, believe it or not, there's a lot of buzz and a lot of aura around this, but I don't think it's as big as people think. The Trump administration, to its credit, has craftily used an immigration order to get enormous publicity and enormous attention. But the number of people actually impacted is fairly low. So on closing, just consult lawyers before you do anything strategic, like 14 days in a non-Schengen country. I think that's in a couple of questions. I think if you have questions because you have concerns about your visa, I think, Liz, you would agree, right? You've got to go to the lawyer. Like, don't make any assumptions about anything said today as applicable to you.
Thank you, Doug. I think that was a great wrap up. I'd like to leave everybody here with thanking you for making time again. I have that feeling we may have to come back together again in a couple of weeks, depending on what's happening on that front. But for now, really thank you, Liz. Thank you, Doug, for your insights. And I think that was very interesting to all those who attended. We had very good attendance, I think, of more than 60 people listening in. And I hope we were able to answer some of the questions and certainly lift some of the concerns that are around this just by not understanding what exactly it meant. So thank you very much and have all a very good rest of your day. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Liz. And bye-bye.